Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Sound of Finance, your podcast for the financial services industry. My name is Matthias Stockner. I'll be your host today. And my guest is Noor van Boven, former Chief People Officer at N26 and currently co-founder and owner at Invested, a consulting firm that provides services for FinTechs focused on scaling the organization, and an investor in startup companies with diverse founder teams. We're particularly excited about the opportunity to talk about corporate culture, purpose-driven organizations, and the role of diversity in today's work environment with not only a subject matter expert, but someone who can really draw on significant experience in the financial services industry. Happy to have you here today, Noor, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. I'm very excited to be on your podcast. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you. Well, Noor, before we jump into the topics, let me start by asking, what led you to where you are and, more importantly, to who you are today?
To who I am today, that's such a big topic. So let me see how I can answer that and where I got in my career. I think a few things have really defined to where I am. First of all, I'm quite a curious person and I'm easily bored. So that means that whether it's in the workplace or when I'm traveling or general in life, I will always seek for new information and new opportunities and new adventures. And that helps. So if you have that in combination with feeling a sense of ownership and responsibilities on topics that you take on, your journey goes quite natural. And then sometimes after a while you look back and it looks like a very well pre-prepared path, right? So I could now give you a whole corporate story how I went step by step. But the reality is just like I stumbled upwards in my career by just taking on more and more and more and people trusting me to take on whatever opportunity I saw.
Excellent. I like very much the element that you touch on, that it's stumbling upwards, I think is an excellent way of putting it. I actually heard an interview on the weekend with Michael Sandel, Harvard professor on philosophy, where he talks about the tyranny of merit. And he talks about exactly that phenomenon that a lot of us forget once we get to where we are and once we are perceived as successful, we think that it's our own doing, when in reality, the element of luck and stumbling upwards is oftentimes sort of critical to remember.
Yeah.
Let's jump right into the middle of things. A former colleague of mine referred to the work environment that we're all facing today as being the age of always on transformation. Would you second that? And if so, what does that mean to you?
It's a good statement. It's definitely true in the environments where I work, right? I do think that in general, like if you look at society, things are just changing faster, right? I think that's a fact of life, and there's enough data backing up that statement. And it also means that we as human beings need to adapt to constant change, whether that's in our private lives, with the societal issues that are challenging us, but also in the workplace. I think working in a fast-changing financial industry, working in scale-ups, where I'm mainly working, change is a constant by the nature and the DNA of it, right? And that also requires that we as human beings become really adaptable and flexible to navigate that. And find ways like how can we comfortably manage through that change without it constant feeling as disruptive change. And we could talk about what it means for an HR organization, but I personally really I think it's an obligation for leadership to guide people to the change, that it feels as organic change rather than constant radical change, because that will have a different impact on people.
Mm-hmm. You touched on already the responsibilities of leadership, and obviously as an extension of that, the responsibilities of the organization. Where do you see the responsibility of people themselves, and how can they navigate this constant change? What do they need in your experience, other than sort of support from their leaders? What do they need? What skills do they need to bring to the table or need to develop in order to navigate this landscape?
I think what will happen for people is and for some people that comes more natural than others, is to always build in, even in fast-moving organization, build in reflection time, right? So, because when you're in the weed of things and the smaller and on the smallest, if you're operating on a very small level of detail, that can also be with strategic work, by the way. It doesn't have to do with the level of work, but when you're deep down in something, it's very difficult to see where you are operating in the journey, and forcing yourself, and it could even be with small habits, like on a Friday, just writing 3 bullets to reflect on the week and just look back on what you reflected on in multiple weeks, is forcing you to go above the topics that you are in and seeing the full landscape. And it's a little bit like, this is a bit of a different element, but it has the same dynamic to it. If you look at cultural changes, if you live in a small village, you will probably say, okay, in my village, we're so different than the people on the next village, and it feels like extreme difference. But then if you're going abroad or you're going to a different province, you will actually see, oh, me and that next village are actually have a lot in common. You are much stranger. And then if you go abroad, you will actually relate to your country culture. And if you go to a different continent, you might actually feel European. Because the higher up you go, the different the context belongs, and the differences are becoming smaller. And I think it operates on exactly the same way when you're talking about change journeys. So you need yourself to force yourself that if change feels really big on a process you are working on, elevate yourself either on your team perspective or on your company perspective within the industry. And the bigger you make your field of operating and the perspective and the lens through which you are looking at the elements that you're touching, the smaller the changes will feel and the easier to navigate. And I think it's really important that people force themselves for that reflection time.
What I very much liked is how you explained the view on differences that you have between sort of the people in the village next to you, because that's something I think that all of us recognize is when I'm in my own city, I would never walk up to somebody and say, hey, you're from the same city. You know, you should either try this or try that or do this and do that. However, when, for instance, I remember a time when my wife and I traveled to New York, we ran into somebody from Vienna, and which is where I'm from, and you immediately have something in common and you focus on that commonality, that's sort of the smallest common denominator. And there's an immediate level of trust simply based on the fact that you're from the same city. They will take your recommendation of where to go to eat in a different city, that city being New York in that case, because you focus on that commonality. And I think it's important to, like you said, also make time for that kind of reflection and look at the bigger picture every once in a while.
No, yeah, because you were saying it from an employee perspective, but that also means that as a leader, if you're talking about responsibility of leaders and also an HR organization, it's to provide that bigger perspective, right? So change, especially in a company perspective, is never happening overnight. Things happen for a reason. Even the biggest change programs don't happen overnight. And it's leadership that needs to help the employees to see that bigger picture. And that bigger picture is also not a transactional one-off moment, right? That is taking people constantly on a journey and showing people, like when you're going from A to B, that it's not a straight line that you're following. It will be a curvy road, right? But it's leadership that needs to explain, this is our curvy road. Look, we're taking a slide to the left or a slide to the right, but this is how we're directionally still tracking to B. And giving that perspective, it's the employee's responsibility to seek that reflection and that higher insight, but it's leadership's responsibility to provide that.
We often talk about in that context about the responsibility of leadership. As an organization, though, what is the framework that I need to provide for my leaders in the organization? Or what sort of upskilling do I need to provide in order for leaders to also meet those requirements and be able to address those challenges?
Yeah, you need to provide leaders with everything that they need in order to provide that perspective. So that's a couple of things. One, the leaders need to understand that that's their responsibility. So you need to be very explicit about it and say, this is what we expect from you. And then making sure that your leaders have all the information to actually give their perspective. And in a lot of organizations, the communication is stuck already very high at the top, right? So the leaders don't have the information to provide context to their team. And there is a fundamental truth in the world. You don't know what you don't know, right? So yes, you need to tell leaders, ask for it, but if they don't know that the information is out there, they don't know. So the higher up, and I don't really like to think in hierarchies, but for communication, hierarchy is actually has a good function. The higher up you come, the more important it is that you really think through, what is it that my direct reports don't know that they don't know? And that I need to proactively provide to them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And we always say that it starts at the top. Any kind of change, I think change in general needs, for one, a top-down element, but at the same time, a grassroots sort of bottom-up, so it needs to be the top-down and then the bottom-up sort of grassroots movement that somewhere then meets in the middle to actually implement successful change. Because that ultimately leads me to the next question is established financial services companies versus the fintech space. When it comes to adaptability or a propensity for transformation, existential transformation, or even minor changes themselves, where do you see the key differences between the fintech space and sort of more a startup mentality and established financial services when it comes to their adaptability and their ability to complete transformations?
It's not limited to the financial industry. I think for all corporates versus startups, companies operate really well if they have very clear structures and processes for operational excellence. But the magic happens by the glue. And what I mean with the glue is where the people solve it when the process or the structure gets in the way, right? So people know each other, so we can touch on it separately, but I really like building out subcultures and sub-communities in the organization so that those people become those glue layers, right? So if you work on a different department than I do, and something needs to happen really fast because otherwise the customer gets in really big problems, because I know you, I'll contact you immediately, Matthias, and we just make it work, right? Because the process would block the success of it. And that is the glue, but I can only do that if I know who you are and I'm not stuck in a process to get to you. And I think where startups and scale-ups can learn from the larger organization is to perfectionalize some of the processes and the systems where they are actually contributing to operational excellence. But I think in a lot of the older and larger organizations, the focus on process and structures have become so rigid that there is hardly any room for the glue that is needed to make the machine really operate smoothly, right? Or the oil is better than glue. I don't think glue makes machines in general operate. But like there's no room for the oil, right, anymore. And I think that this is where startups have an advantage, especially in rapidly changed environments, where the change will happen because basically the oil is making sure that with all those moving pieces that are constantly changing, that they still function together as one operating system. And that's where I think the changing DNA is asking more and more to revisit where is a process helpful and where is a process blocking, and same for a system or an organizational structure.
I think that also that feeds directly into the next topic that I wanted to touch on with you is I find that oftentimes fintechs or startup companies in a broader sense, if they're founder and owner operated, there's a driving force behind what they do. There's a reason they started doing what they're doing today, and you can categorize that as purpose. There's the reason, the underlying why am I doing this, and we hear more and more, the role of purpose. It's critical to put purpose at the core of your strategy, and so on and so forth. And the question, though, remains in an industry that's as well established as the financial services industry and that has been around for as long as it has. How do I introduce purpose into those types of traditional financial service providers when their mission or what they do has been very clearly defined for a long period of time?
There are two things I think we need to differentiate. So you have purpose in the sense of why are we doing what we're doing? And we have purpose as it's being used more societal, right? So then the purpose assumes that you have that your why is also doing it for a greater good, right? The reason why in especially the fast-changing environments that we are operating in, you need to know why you're doing something, is because the what is constantly changing, and to ensure that you're still going. There's a lot of opportunities, and opportunities also distract. And if you have a constantly changing what in a highly distracted environment, you will lose course. You will lose traction on the direction where you are going. And by constantly communicating why you are doing something, the why is your only compass as an organization with the changing what's. So that's one piece of it. The second piece on the more societal element of purpose has to do, I think, with a much more bigger topic that we see in society in general, is that we've landed in an era of humanity where we are all driven by a greater good, right? We associate it more with the younger generations. I think it's more a timing thing, right? Like we are more involved in environment. It's no longer enough that a company is there for profit only. It's like, what are you doing with the profit? What is the whole purpose of having profit? Why would you have profit? Why would you strive for profit? Those are the questions that are now being brought up in society. And that means that for very many reasons, there's the outside pressure of your external stakeholders, and external stakeholders is talent. Can you hire the right people? They demand that you're not only doing it for profit. You see it more and more in the investment scene, right? They want to see profits and, of course, financial return on investment. But you're seeing a shift that they also want to see what is the additional contribution that you are making to the world. So it's a big shift happening in the world in general. And we can link that also to a topic close to my heart with diversity and inclusion, is where if you're looking at the financial industry, they've been struggling for a long time to get a very diverse workforce because the association it has changed. I think originally the financial institutions were very much the core and the pillar of society, but it has changed, of course, over time with this narrative of like financial institutions are only there to finance themselves mainly and becoming richer and becoming the money business. Now what you're seeing, and we saw that, for example, very strongly with N26, most of the people working there were really attracted by fighting financial literacy and making financial services more accessible and understandable for other people, right? And I think when we can also educate more of like how those financial services are supporting a broader group in the world. And it can be like I work for a financial services organization who are creating payment systems in emerging markets, right? It actually helps people to operate and connect to the economy. But I also work for a trading platform that says like we want to normalize trading and making investments by educating people that they really understand what they need to do, but they all can have access to it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think by wording, and that's not only your branding thing, that's really intrinsically showing how you are contributing beyond your own financial profits, will attract a different group of people and will link much stronger to where society is at the moment. Yeah. Also for investors. And customers, by the way, also demand it, right? Like
exactly, I think, and that's no matter which conversation I'm in right now with sort of board level executives, it's always about customer centricity.
Yeah.
And you touched on two very important points that I want to pick up sequentially. The first one was sort of the role of purpose, and I think how to implement it so it doesn't sound like or seem like a branding exercise. And we'll touch on that first.
Yeah.
And the second point was the role of diversity, especially in financial services, that I then obviously want to dedicate some time to as well. But let's start with the first one. Because a lot of times we have these conversations, and we're doing a lot of workshops right now around mission, vision, values with a whole array of traditional financial service providers. And the biggest challenge is that executives or the teams that work on these topics, they always have the external perspective in mind. How will this be received by my customers, for instance? How can these organizations, or what kind of mindset shift needs to happen so it's an actual purpose-driven organization, and so that purpose is at the core of what they do, versus having it simply be a branding exercise?
Well, it starts with like the fact that I spoke about the talent market and forgot about the customer shows the the different focus that people have, and that you can get slightly blindsided. In general, everyone is society, right? So for most of the financial services that we offer, it's all the same, right? Your future or your current employees are also your customers in the other way around, being it even if it's if you're operating in small business area or B2B. What is important is that people recognize it. Like it's a very transparent and vocal time, right? So your employees' thoughts are all over the internet, right? So if your employees are not buying what you're selling external, that brand proposition will fall through immediately because your brand is lived by everyone who's there internally. So while you maybe 15 to 20 years ago could brand the S, sorry for my language, out of authenticity, nowadays you better be authentic, right? Because it will be on the street immediately. Like if your founder starts preaching that it all comes from a deeper purpose, and internally people know that that's not true, it's just a matter of days that the outside world knows, right? So it will just fall apart, right? So I think it's very important that you internally, I mean, it's the obvious thing, but that you have a good representation of the outside world, and that you act internally completely in line with what you're selling externally, right? And then, because then the circle is round, and then everything that you align internally will also land well externally for the people for who it needs to land well. You don't need to be a service for all.
Now, if I look at take an organization, and I think it starts with, or what I'm understanding is, it starts with leaders of the organization recognizing the role that purpose can play. Now, let's assume for a minute that this mindset shift has already happened, right? And I think a lot of leaders will agree with that proposition. Once that mindset shift has happened, though, how do I actually introduce this purpose within my organization and then make sure that I'm able to scale it throughout the organization?
Yeah, but your question assumes that people need to bring in purpose, but everyone has a purpose. It might not be a purpose I like, but like everyone has a purpose. You started, like, you do something for a reason, whatever that reason is, right? So it's much more about focalizing why you're doing what you are doing. And it can already be interesting as an executive team, just to ask around the room, why are you working here? And probably everyone has a different reason, right? The one person's purpose to work there in a FinTech scale-up, which is a lifestyle job, it will eat out of your personal life. There's a reason why you are doing that. Let's get your own purpose could be that it's for career acceleration. And that's also okay. And for someone else, it is to solve financial literacy, right? So everyone, it's also okay to have different purposes, but it will help you to openly talk about it, right? So it's good as a team to align, okay, what is it that we are trying to achieve as an organization? What is the why? And it's very easy, especially on board and executive level, to continues to focus on the what, because you're so in the numbers and measuring the impact of what. That doesn't mean that every board meeting you constantly need to talk about the why, but once in a while checking in, are we still on the same company why? We can still have our own individual why, is very relevant, again, on what I said, like to understand we're all on the same course. Because when you check in, we're still on the same why of what we're doing, it will make your what discussions easier. And there are constant what discussion. All your trade-off decisions are what. All the boardroom conflicts are around what, right? And going back to are we still on the same why will help you to solve those as well. So it's not only from a greater good perspective to look at your purpose, it's actually from operational excellence perspective quite relevant to go back to that point.
The question, though, is, and this might be a very difficult one to answer, to what degree does the understanding of purpose for each individual need to align with the greater purpose of the organization? Or to what degree do they need does the individual purpose understanding need to align with my colleagues and the people, my peers in an organization, in order for there to be the necessary cohesion that I can discuss the what in a very rational space, because I know that we share the why?
I think you need to be and this is also the reason why you need to be externally explicit about your why, especially also coming back to the talent aspect in your recruitment process, so people can self-select out. Because while not everyone needs to have a shared primary why you are there on the day-to-day, you should all have the company why somewhere in the reasons why you are there. Because like if the why defines all the trade-offs that you are making for your what, your employees all need to be aligned on their journey. Like if that end state, which should be an unachievable end state, but like if that end goal that is directionally telling you where to go is not lived by your entire organization, it will be gone. Right? So, but for me, it's more around a self-selecting out opportunity by being really explicit and vocal about it, because it will form their day-to-day. Every decision is based on that why.
So what I'm hearing, though, is that the intrinsic purpose that we share and branding are not mutually exclusive, but rather there's a correlation, and I need to brand myself along the lines of my purpose in order to pre-select, or in order to give people a chance to self-select whether or not they want to be part of a particular organization.
Yeah, and that even goes on and that is even on an individual level, right? So if you bring it back to a very operational thing, but like recruitment, As an organization, you know yourself as an organization best.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an illusion to think you can interview someone for 5 hours to have a watertight process that will make sure that that person is successful in your context. And I will tell you, there's no such things as superstars or not superstars. People are a superstar in the right environment. And it's your mission to find the people who can excel in your context. In that process, the candidate knows themselves best and you know you best. So you have an obligation to be brutally honest about your context. And the candidate ideally has on their mind that they have the duty to put their true self on the table. And that includes the why they are doing stuff. So you can both objectively assess whether this is the context for that person to be successful. I fully understand in reality it's different. People want to go for the job. Everyone's selling themselves and companies are selling themselves. But in the core, every person should understand what makes them tick or why they want to join an organization and what they need from that organization, right? Like what are your triggers and your motivators, and putting that on the table and understanding your own purpose as a human being and sharing that with another organization and asking the other organization, does that fit how you operate, is super important.
No. Then maybe let me sort of draw the connection here between, or try to draw the connection between purpose and culture, corporate culture, that is. To what extent does purpose influence the corporate culture that I have?
I think for a large extent, and mainly because why you are doing things very often also influence and comes from the same values as how you are doing things. And for me, culture is around how you are doing things. So they're very strongly connected because the values that are underpinning your why and your how are the same values, right? So there's a very strong correlation between the two.
Okay, so if purpose is why am I doing a certain thing, then the culture is my view of how to best get there. How are we going to do it?
Yeah, and both operate on a foundation of values, and they're the same.
Mm-hmm. And then, which leads me directly into the next point. What do you think is the biggest lever for corporate culture? How can I influence it, or what is the biggest lever in order to influence corporate culture?
There are a lot of levers, I think, but the biggest one is your people, right? Because in the end, an organization is just a community of people. And if culture is how we interact, that is defined by the collective of that group, right? They create their rituals and the rhythms, etc. Like you cannot formalize. There are small things that you can implement as an organization to support your culture, right? With every process that you put in place, you underline or you strengthen the cultural foundation of an organization. But no matter how many corporate rituals you have put in place around a certain culture, if you are an organization with 500 people and you're hiring randomly 500 people, not linked to your current setup, those 500 people will completely define your company culture. And to a certain extent, that's okay, right? So, for example, if you have a larger organization, like if you're multinational, your culture has already been embedded for so long, rituals are completely embedded, and the people coming in are such a small percentage of your current organization that they will be completely onboarded in your culture, and when new people are coming in, they already became your cultural ambassadors.
Yeah.
And you go into a hyper-growth, that's a very different thing. Your culture is really an organically changing part because you're hiring new people, probably from different backgrounds, so that's changing, right? The same thing is when you're opening a new office. That's why you also very often partially by the culture of where the organization is, but even with large international organizations where the country culture is not that strongly recognized in an office, you still see that every office has their own culture.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that they started from scratch, hiring people who started to put that culture in place, and they created their own rituals. And that's also okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they will never, there's enough on a company level so that there is a connection, but it's also okay that your office in Vienna has a slightly different culture than the office in Berlin or the office in Barcelona. And that doesn't mean that everyone in Barcelona is Spanish, right? Yeah, so that's, I think, the main thing. It's about people. So that also means that if you want to change your culture,
mm-hmm.
actually looking at your candidate pipeline,
mm-hmm.
and setting a different tone can help you change that culture. And I think a very good example is Uber, for example. They had years ago cultural problems. I don't think that's a secret. And what they always have been really strong at from the beginning was in their recruitment practices. And they have literally almost redesigned their culture of what are elements that we want to keep. We want to keep the culture of drive and fast and speed and ownership. But we want to add more inclusive elements. We want to have a more diverse thought. We want to have more team play, peer elements, etc. And they've adjusted some of their HR processes, but what they mainly did is that they changed some of the elements in the recruitment process to make that more inclusive and target different profile to diversify the organization. And it was a journey of years. But now if you look at elements of an inclusive culture, Uber is actually leading by a lot of those examples. Now, no one would have thought that, right? 5 or 6 years ago.
I think that is an excellent example, and also a perfect segue into the second sort of part that I highlighted earlier that we wanted to talk about, the element of diversity. And I think you mentioned also in the beginning, I think in the financial services industry and the traditional financial service providers, you mentioned in the beginning sort of struggle with the element of diversity. And sort of a more inclusive work environment. Can you talk a little bit more about what exactly does that mean and how are times changing?
Yeah, so I think that the stigma of the financial industry, right, which is still a bit, either old school bankers of Wall Street, right, but both have a very strong male connotation to it. I think what is shifting is that we are seeing more and more the responsible role of financial institutions in society. I think that's opening up and making the industry a bit more appealing to a broader talent group. I do think there's still a lot of work to be done, to be honest. Mm-hmm. I think it will help when they're talking more about the role in society and also the purpose behind some of the services. I do think it's really important because your customers also nowadays are equally men and women, the financial, even in most households, of course. I'm stating all the obvious, people in the financial industry should all know it, but the financial decisions are mainly made by women, right? And then it's the men designing the products, leading very often to a lot of male customers, obviously. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important that you create a culture where all voices of society are represented. That's not only gender diversity, I'm now focusing on that, mm-hmm. but it should be from all elements of society. And when the banking and the financial industry in general is associated with a high privilege part of society, it's not only men, it's also associated with high privilege, rich backgrounds. Look around you, that's not the world that we are operating in. That's actually a very small target group, right? Mm-hmm. If you would go out with a product only targeting that product group, most of your investors will say, no, that's not a great market opportunity. So why would you then only focus on that talent pool?
Yeah, absolutely.
And as an organization, you need to understand that to change the dynamic, you need to put in active effort. Because it's not, when companies are less diverse, it's not coming from bad intent. There's no one in that system who doesn't want to hire a different candidate profile. It's way more subtle than that. So going through it and opening it up. And I mean, there's some very easy, obvious things to change to make your organization more inclusive. It will have the business effect, but it will also help your company culture, and it will have a spin wheel effect. You need to make the first changes for it to also open up and increase more.
And there's something that you mentioned that I want to pick up on. I think that because when it comes to diversity, it's an issue that is by its nature very subtle.
Yeah.
What I mean in the sense of the effects that lead to a lack of diversity are often very subtle. Nobody's purposely sort of doing that.
Yeah.
The question that I have is exactly along those lines. When we look over time, any movement that focuses on, or that has at its core and at its heart a desire for more equality, social justice, these movements were typically propelled forward by certain instances, certain events that happened. I'm talking about, for instance, Rosa Parks or Emmett Till in the United States when it came to racial equality. But because the issue of lack of diversity in the workplace is so much more subtle, what would propel this movement forward?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because basically what you're touching on, the elements that you are saying, I also think in society, by the way, that it's more subtle, but the events that you're talking about is much more the radical change, right? And we have seen some of those elements, by the way, like it is the people who have been speaking up and suing their employers in Silicon Valley really created a big change. I would say, like, in general, I think we need to differentiate between activism, which in society can have great effects, right? Like, and big moments in history come from that. I think in organizations, like, I'm more of a fan of organic change and making sure that there is an opportunity to speak up, right? Because those moments of activism and rebellion, they happen in organization is when people feel that they can speak up. And I think if with you as an employer, your employees need to go to acts of activism because they're not heard, you already lost the battle and you missed the mark a long time ago.
Yeah.
And that's also what happened in society. And I think, I mean, it's 2020, or 2021 even. Yeah, can you imagine? So by now, creating an environment of inclusion and belonging and creating, you were talking at the beginning of the podcast about grassroots initiatives. I mean, it's very basic that you have employee resource groups. It's very basic that you have Ask Me Anything sessions and opportunities for people to speak up, and that you have speak up guidelines that people can raise those topics. So I think you should be able to already have a very open dialogue in your organization around creating a culture of inclusion and belonging. You should be able to avoid activism to be necessary to become a more inclusive workplace.
Very good. I like that thought. And I like what you said about sort of the organic change and the role of the grassroots movement and in order to sort of continue the movement.
There's still a long way to go, but
I was going to ask you exactly that. I think there's two measures by which we can sort of assess this type of movement, diversity movement. One is the distance to where we want to go. You already said we still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
But also sort of the velocity, the trajectory that we're on. Do you feel that this movement is picking up speed? Is it already at a degree where you think organic change can happen in a very conducive way, or does it still need to speed up?
For me, it definitely needs to speed up. Like I have had moments where I thought, oh, no, it's really getting traction. I mean, actually, like when you're talking about societal change, like I think what happened last year around Black Lives Matter, I think triggered a lot of conversations and change in the workplace as well. I think that's good. But then if you look at the implication of COVID and you see that in every country, Western or non-Western, it has the biggest impact on employment of women disproportionately and set back women completely in the workplace, shows how fragile it is. So even the small movements that we have made with one world crisis has been set back significantly to an extent that it has taken us years and years and years to make that progress, and it's just one COVID virus that wipes it off the table, right? And another element is like me and my co-founder, we're very active in the investing scene and mainly focusing on female founders. If you look at the investment gap from a gender perspective, and it's purely gender, because like if you look at ethnicity, it's even worse. I mean, those numbers are shocking. You really think that you're living in a different era, right? So I think we are like, if you're looking at the culture of inclusion and belonging within the workplace and the moments to speak up, I think a lot of positive progress is being made. And I think most companies do have more grassroots initiatives and opportunities for people to speak up. But it's still necessary for people to speak up. Yep. And we're very far away from a world of equal opportunity. And every employer, every manager, every person who can influence it from whatever, whether you're part of hiring teams or you're a team lead, everyone needs to feel the responsibility to contribute to that change. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
I think that's very true. That it's not only the people that want to see the change happening that play a role in making it so, but others that are also accepting of the change and allowing it to happen rather than sort of investing their energy in oftentimes blocking it.
Yeah, and I think everyone should feel the need for that change, right? Yeah. Because even if you are not a minority within the setting that you are in, there's always a setting where you can be a minority, but bringing it back, like moving it away from diversity and bringing it to inclusion and belonging, everyone wants to work in an environment where everyone can bring themselves and where everyone gets equal opportunity and access to things, whether you use it or not, right?
Which I think perfectly closes the loop to the importance of purpose.
Yes.
Because if I have a common purpose, that's all I need to know. It doesn't matter who somebody is, where they're from, what they look like, which gender they belong to. If I have that shared purpose, that's the one thing that matters. That's what's going to propel me forward as a team, and that's what's going to carry me. I can see that, look, quite frankly, this conversation could also go on for 3 hours. I can definitely, I have a million follow-up questions still to ask, but we do face a certain timeline restriction with the length of our podcast.
Of course.
So I want to give you one final or one opportunity. Is there anything, any final thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners about sort of the things that we talked about today?
No, if anyone wants to connect about this topic, like please reach out to me on LinkedIn, because I always love to hear other perspective. And all of the topics that we touched on are not transactional right or wrong perspective, right? It are evolving perspectives, and it's a reflection of how I formed my thoughts over the years, and that doesn't mean that they won't change, right? So if anyone has a different perspective or can contribute to my own journey, then I would love to hear that feedback.
Excellent. Well, I can only second that thought. Obviously, this podcast will be shared throughout social media, so please do. So we'll mainly post it on LinkedIn first, and then on our other ZDB social media channels. If you want to engage directly, this is a message to our listeners. If you want to engage directly with Noor, then please do reach out to her via LinkedIn. If you want to engage with us on this topic, with both Noor and myself, Please feel free to comment and share your thoughts on these topics. Other than that, I want to thank all of our listeners for their time today, and especially our guest, Noor van Boven, for her time and her thoughts on issues that I believe have gained in relevance over time and are now really at the forefront of the current work environment that we face. So thank you very much again. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Cool. Thank you, Matthias. Same here.